Hello, all. This is Cameron with Scholastic Lutherans. I am currently uploading this video for my own channel, but I will probably put this up on the main account. So in this video, I am defending the viability of young Earth creationism. I take this to be the position that the Earth was prepared over the course of 6 natural or 24-hour days. I will also defend the global character of Noah's flood, which is typically defended alongside the first belief. Of course, one could defend a global flood without a belief in 6 natural creation days. Many have done so in the past. One could also defend a local flood without affirming them. There have been people in church history, believe it or not, who have defended a local flood for one reason or another, and who didn't express similar skepticism about the 6 creation days. I'm thinking Matthew Pohl, for instance. But in order to simplify the matter, I will defend both propositions together. So that begins section 1, where I defend the doctrine of apparent age, which I think is essential to young Earth creationism as such. In this section, I will defend a model of young Earth creationism, YEC for short, that does not rely on creation science, the project of collecting evidence for a young Earth created by God 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. I will also try to defend a model of the global flood that does not hinge upon the controversial notion of flood geology. The idea that Noah's flood, deemed to be global in extent, has a wide and discernible impact on the geological column. Perhaps there is extensive evidence for both ideas. I'm not a geologist. Nonetheless, given how controversial both notions are in the broader scientific community, I will jettison a commitment to both models of creation research in favor of apparent age and a supernatural account of Noah's flood. So that presses the question, what is apparent age? The doctrine of apparent age states that God sometimes creates things that look as though they went through a long and drawn out process to come to the way that we see them today, yet without having went through that process. Philip Goss, the originator of the omphalos or navel hypothesis, asked whether Adam had a belly button or whether the trees in the garden had tree rings. Young Earth creationists generally admit the evidence for the latter is more convincing than the former. That's because Adam's belly button had no discernible function in the context of an apparently aged universe. Trees with long histories might be necessary to produce oxygen for Adam, so they have a function. Similarly, starlights created in transit might serve to evidence the grandeur of God. This is typically something old earthers use to prove, quote unquote, that the universe is old. While at first glance this might appear problematic, I find it no more problematic than many of the issues the old earther has in his model. After all, the old earther still has to explain why God created such a large universe, a universe that might not appear at first glance to evidence his glory to anyone in particular, save he and the angels. There is a distinction between the total and partial apparent age models. For the sake of argument, I will defend the former. That is, I will argue even the fossil record is the result of God creating rocks with the remnants of creatures that may have not even existed. I do not see such a great implausibility here. I do not believe it results in last Thursdayism, the idea God created everything last Thursday with the appearance of age, precisely because God told us what he did. We aren't left in the dark. Indeed, I also see no reason why the skeptical scenario can't apply to other instances of God's workings in the scripture. Do the observers of Jesus' miracle at Cana really need to check their senses? Does Adam, seeing his mature body, need to question the truthfulness of God? I see no reason why either ought to. They have a spontaneous principle of credulity, appealing to Thomas Reid here. They are inclined to believe that which is before their senses. When God, through the light of faith, tells them there's more to the story, that only enlightens their inference. Perhaps the opponent of total apparent age will claim fossils evidence death in the creation record, and that's incompatible with God's very good creation, despite the fact that a number of young earthers in church history didn't see a contradiction between animal death and Genesis 1, Aquinas and Augustine, for example. I myself fail to see the contradiction on the supposition of a no animal death before the fall scenario. All of God's works have a functional element and a non-functional element. The sheer height of a mountain might be functional for Adam, but it being this height rather than that one doesn't matter much. Moreover, perhaps God was anticipating the fall with certain features of creation, without thereby willing the actual occurrence of the fall. God creates oil deposits, for instance, and these may have been present before the fall because God knew we would use it after it. God's mission in Genesis 1 was to create a world in the middle of things that would anticipate the processes that would take place afterwards. Young earthers are at least comfortable with plant and invertebrate death, fossils. Why couldn't God place the fossils of a large creature or a T-Rex in the record? By saying that young earthers are comfortable with this, I'm saying that many of them don't see any strong incompatibility between the death of these things and God's very good creation. This just isn't something covered in Genesis 1. But perhaps Adam, living for a long time, would see this as evidence of the extent and the strength of God's creative word, such that he is able to subdue and outlast a creature of such magnitude. That may sound implausible, but to me, it's no more implausible and ad hoc than the way us Christians explain the relation of microscopic features of creation in remote parts of the galaxy to the ultimate glory of God. For instance, what relationship does, say, a tiny planet the size of Pluto, in a very distant galaxy have on humans? Well, presumably very little, but God still has a reason for willing it, and even that little contribution for God isn't nothing, and such. And as such, he is capable, and in a sense, it's fitting for him to will those sorts of things to show that he is interested not just in the big picture, but numbering the hairs on our head. Moreover, this is not all too different from the predicament creationists have always been in. Aristotle thought the world was eternal. Christians, meanwhile, typically argue that God was capable of creating in the middle of Aristotle's eternal sequence. I think that's right, and I think God has good reasons to create in the way he did. God is like a novelist who flings his characters in the middle of a story. The story has an interesting backstory, one that the reader can speculate on and study. After all, the backstory has conceptual existence in God's mind. The things the geologist works with are fossils, markers of things that would have exemplars in the divine intellect. The scientist can study these markers ex hypothesis, on the hypothesis that God created them billions of years ago, but he doesn't have to commit himself to their actual existence, if other evidence, namely the evidence of Scripture, suggests otherwise. Indeed, I think this conceptual model of creation has much fruit in theology. Ken Colson argues God has a set procedure in mind with what he terms supernatural formative processes, or SFPs for short. SFPs are essentially accelerated natural processes that God uses on the creation days. On day 3, God uses supernatural formative processes to bring the seed-bearing plants into the picture in record time. Similarly, he also wills that the earth and water start separating on day 3. On my model, God is willing a creative strategy where the earth, already containing fossils, starts a process of tectonic activity that would mimic its later movements after the fall. Scientists are right to study these processes. They do indicate the method and strategy God has in mind, but you shouldn't expect God to work in precisely the way the record indicates in terms of ladder, normal speed processes. God also has a conceptual ordering of the creation days in terms of how the days relate to one another. That is to say, the plants on day 3 and the light on day 1 would ordinarily rely on the sun for light bearing and sustenance. Indeed, God might work the laws of physics with the sun in mind during these formative processes, sustaining the plants in the Earth's orbit supernaturally to indicate the future existence and the role of the greater light. Why would God do this? Well, firstly, he might will the stars before the Earth because humans are special in God's creation. The sheer magnitude of creation wouldn't evidence this, but its first place in God's works of old sure might. Secondly, humans were inclined to worship the sun and moon and seasons. God is evidencing the fact he doesn't need them, and the fact that they were creations that serve at his will and fiat. Many of God's miracles have a logical ordering. That is, they reflect the normal natural causes they are supposed to mimic. When God turns water into wine, he may have ordered the water to wine process in terms of the long drawn out operation whereby grapes are turned into suitable fruits of the vine. There is a conceptual universe in God's mind and a physical universe in reality. The scientist's job is to think God's thoughts after him, but not necessarily in the way God thought them. So the non young earther is right to see creation as evidencing process, but he is wrong to infer this necessarily implies normal speed processes. It could, but if God tells us otherwise, or if we can infer different types of processes from good and necessary consequences, that ought to be sufficient. So that leads us into section 2, the global flood. In this section, I will defend an approach to a global great deluge that doesn't rely on the controversial tenets of flood geology. Flood geology states that Noah's flood, interpreted as a globally expansive event, has a broad and discernible impact on the geological column, explaining much or all of the relevant strata. Creationists differ on the details. The so-called new creationists differ from the old Morris Whitcomb tradition, but they all agree the flood is empirically relevant to the world as we know it. Since I have already defended a view of creation that hinges upon thoroughly coherent maturity in the created order, I have no need to assert that dinosaurs were on the ark. That same sentiment applies to other biological entities presumed to be long extinct. While I do think the problem of post-flood speciation is a difficult one, there are a number of non-scientific accounts available to the Christian. That is to say, these accounts do not rely on uniform natural mechanisms or causality. I will discuss two such accounts below. My account. So while global flood proponents argue the account presupposes a natural explanation for the source of the floodwaters, I do not believe the account provides any deductive data to that effect. The account says the waters came from the fountains of the great deep and the windows of the heavens. Obviously, the language here is phenomenological, but Christians should still try and preserve the import of figurative language whenever possible. Basically, at a minimum, the account presupposes that God flooded the earth through the sky and the waters below it. But beyond that, the text is indifferent as to whether God created and dried the flood according to ordinary or extraordinary providence. Since the design of the text is decreational, God is wiping out humanity and those creatures God designed to associate with him, I suggest the theological considerations of the narrative strongly lean towards extraordinary providence. As such, we don't need to say that, precisely the amount of water that we have today is more or less what God was working with in the flood. That may be the case, but that isn't something I'm committed to. That is to say, God floods the earth and dries the earth according to supernatural causality. That much is evident in that the creative wind of Genesis 8:1 closely mimics the Holy Spirit of Genesis 1:2, who no doubt exercised extraordinary providence a number of times in the Genesis narrative. It is no typical wind that is drawing the waters, but God's wind, aka his Spirit, the third person of the Blessed Trinity. This will factor heavily into my account of the flood. God has a decreative strategy in mind with the global flood, and that includes wiping out the remnants of Noah's world, and perhaps the carcasses of the animals associated with them. So perhaps it is not so evident that the archaeologist would find significant remains from the flood. While Noah's civilization may have been developed, we may not find suggestions of that in the record. Since I think it's plausible the sons of God in Genesis 6 are fallen angelic entities, perhaps the artifacts they brought to man were perverse and dangerous. I agree with Heiser that this is in large part why God flooded the earth, to solve the Nephilim problem. Moreover, since God's decreative plans didn't extend to the fish, there is no need to explain the continued existence of freshwater and saltwater fishes in terms of natural adaptations. God may have miraculously preserved them, just as he preserved the light properties of the fire in Daniel's furnace. The fire's light would typically be associated with its heat and motion, but God wanted the miracle to be obvious. Indeed, he didn't design the miracle to extinguish every feature of his very good creation. Man's continued use of fire is one of his chief merits. Similarly, God didn't design the flood to wipe out the geological features of creation. God wanted the boundaries of Eden, which approximate those of the promised land, to be preserved, and that includes not wiping out the rivers. Recall, Genesis 15 assumes the continued existence of the rivers in Genesis 2. Perhaps that also means preserving the face and the grandeur of the original creation. Any globally expansive miracle will involve God acting outside the bounds of ordinary providence to preserve the rest of the goings on of the world at large. As such, since the text was utterly decreational with regards to man and the soulish animals, perhaps extending to artifacts and bones, and indifferent towards everything else, I suggest God may have provided no evidence for the flood, or at the very least, not much evidence. Indeed, many young earthers have suggested the age of the earth and the way the flood is described wouldn't have produced a significant geological impact. Now, of course, that is not the mainstream position. And I wouldn't say that most young earthers hold that view. But it is my understanding that the Goss was not convinced that the flood was able to explain the data, which is why he initially posited his understanding of the geological record, presumably relying on something like Buckland's, placid global flood. As an analogy, let's assume the correct explanation of Joshua's sun miracle in Joshua 10 is that God altered the regular rotation of the earth. Now, of course, that's an exegetically dubious suggestion. I myself am comfortable saying the language here is actually metaphorical, but God does call for the sun to stand still in the sky and not its rays. As a good Lutheran, I believe the literal sense should be preserved whenever possible. Of course, a phenomenological explanation is acceptable here, and I have already appealed to one earlier in the essay with regards to the windows of the heavens and the fountains of the great deep. But I am at least somewhat pleased saying God could have preserved the structure of the earth and its rotation, indeed the existence of man and the animals who were independent of the miracle by a grand cosmic act of providence. Typically, people say that, well, the earth would have been wiped out by, Joshua's sun miracle because the rest of the goings on would be affected. Well, I think God is capable of willing things in such a way that his intended goal is met and everything else is preserved. And that really wouldn't affect God's power at all. I mean, God is capable of subordinating the physical order to the moral order, which involves miraculously acting in man's favor. The miracle was singular in its goal. It was to be a sign for Joshua's army and the enemies and the enemy Amorites. So God preserved the rest of the created order who were outside the context of the miracle. Similarly, perhaps God used floodwaters in a designed way to only punish man and the soulish animals by conduit or attachment. Now that invites the question, why would God use floodwaters at all if he is going to manipulate the scope of its natural causality? Well, there are a number of reasons why God might do just that. Firstly, waters covered the world in the beginning, as Genesis 1 asserts. So it makes sense for God to return creation to that state. Truly, Peter says God created the world through water and the Word. Secondly, Noah's flood prefigures baptism, which God uses to save us from sin, death, and the devil / the fallen entities associated with him, the Nephilim, which were mentioned earlier. All of these were involved in the flood. These are a type for the true salvific antitype of holy baptism. I will skip providing an account of Noah's ark. That gets us into a discussion about what exactly a natural kind means and the intersection of that concept with the various created species. I will just assume that God moved enough created entities on the ark to create the genetic diversity we see today. Since I do not believe Adam ever saw a dinosaur or the vast majority of entities evidenced on the fossil record, as I read in my first essay, I think these only have an ideal existence if my account in that essay is right. That minimizes the amount of species significantly. My account is, again, an account of extraordinary providence. When God fiat commands the animals to be fruitful and multiply in Genesis 8, through 9, that is a fiat of extraordinary providence, just as it was in Genesis 1. With regards to humans equipped with free choice, that command finds no automatic fulfillment. But concerning animals, the case is far different. Just as God can grow the grass and fruit trees of the earth in a day, he can speed up the processes of hyperspeciation by his fiat. That may involve creating other animals not mentioned in the account. I think God created other entities in Genesis 2, not mentioned in Genesis 1 in the context of the garden, but it may not. Just because God wants Adam to preserve two pairs of every kind doesn't necessarily mean these pairs will do all the work of repopulation. There might be a symbolic element to including them on the ark. That is, Noah is doing right by the original intention of God's mandate for humanity and the animals and caring for them, as opposed to the manner in which the pre-diluvian man may have treated them. But even if God doesn't create other animals after the fall, the text makes no mention of this. I actually don't mind conceptualizing this in terms of hyperevolution, albeit guided by God. My main gripes are not with any specific conception of evolution per se. As a matter of fact, my gripes are not necessarily gripes with the notion of common descent. In fact, God may have created man in media res in such a way that a creature with a similar body plan to him might have come about through evolutionary processes, on the hypothesis that God chose to take billions of years. But God has the prerogative to skip through the evolutionary record to get to the good part, which he chose to do over the 6 days to mimic our created work week. Whether this defines migration patterns post-flood is a different story. Maybe it doesn't. But since I have two accounts of how post-flood speciation might work, I am not necessarily concerned here. As others have pointed out, this account is not verifiable. But since my project is not one of empirical proof, but one of synthesis, on the basis of the Bible being a metaphysically certain principle or fount of knowledge, that does not concern me much. Secondly, as Vern Poythress points out in Genesis 8:22, the text assumes environmental regularity is principally the norm post-flood. Perhaps Psalm 104 teaches that this regularity extends to the world before the flood as well. But scientific data, at least during the flood, is not necessarily a perfect guide to the evidence, since science studies the regular behaviors of material substances. But Genesis 8:22 seems to imply the flood was a temporary exemption from God's ordinary plan of regularity through the natural powers of created substances. 2 Peter 3:7 teaches that this regularity will only cease through an event that mimics the causality of the flood, the dissolution of the world through fire in the last days. So with that said, I will stop until section 3. So that leads us into section 3, which are a series of theses on the doctrine of apparent age. So I will begin with the first thesis. I will not read each individual thesis. I won't say thesis 1, I'll just let you fill in the gaps here. So provided God chose to create a causally coherent universe, one absent a cosmic singularity, there will always be at least some inferable past history. That is to say, there are good reasons to think God might create a young universe with an implied but prochronic created or ancient past, that is, a purely conceptual or ideal past history. Peter G. Nelson provides the following formula as a demonstration. Then its state, as represented by the positions of its elementary components, can be expressed as a continuous function of time. Function t, where t equals 0, is the time of creation. Now, since f is a continuous function, states can be calculated from f for t is less than 0. Thus, when t equals 0, the system is created. It inevitably appears to have had a past history. Not even God can create it without it having this appearance. The only exception is if f has an appearance, has a singularity at t equals 0, so presumably a Big Bang type situation. As an illustration, if God chooses to will a causally coherent fruit tree, that fruit tree will involve at least one inferable past history. It grew to such and such a height, had a particular portion of dead bark on its exterior, had a certain amount of fruits, was no longer in seed form, etc. These imply both small-scale and large-scale processes. Even if God willed a singular particle in motion, one going down an infinitely straight path, we could always infer from its current behavior where it would be positioned in the past if it were willed diachronically, that is to say, in real time. Similarly, even if Adam had no belly button, he would have a certain height, have a certain weight, bone density, one consistent with a mature adult male. 7. God's causal strategy for willing Adam into the world was to have Adam interact with a causally coherent creation, perhaps even bringing order to it. That much is true whether the apparent age doctrine is correct. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That which is below and that which is above, he created. But perhaps the earth, that is our locale in the cosmos, is most intelligible through an inferable past history, one almost constitutive of the earth qua earth. The scars of craters, the sedimentation, the presence of buried igneous rocks from prehistoric volcanoes, etc., are all part of what it means to be the earth in the context of our universe. This is almost a form of Origen's essentialism. Just as my physical history is part and parcel of who I am, perhaps the Earth's past history is modally vital to what it is. As such, perhaps the fossils of creatures, whether living or non-living, are essential to shaping the Earth into the coherent whole it is. Dinosaurs, treated as prochronically present, albeit non-existent creatures, may have shaped the Earth's foliage, which had an effect on the soil layers, which may have had an effect on the structure of the Earth. That even applies to the littlest or smallest of animals. Small rodent who died 100,000 years ago in the prochronic past has some causal contribution to the Earth, similar to that of a small planet on the edge of the universe. But no one doubts God has good reasons for willing the latter. Why not will the former? Therefore, God is not putting fossils or non-functional elements into the record to confuse the scientist. No, instead, the scientist is thinking God's thoughts after him, including the elements of logical and implied chronological priority in God's plan for the causally coherent Earth. There is nothing grander than to encounter the mental life of the divine. God could have done this immediately, but he prefers to use secondary causes, whether real or implied. As such, the conceptual universe in God's intellect, the universe implying a past history and a logical ordering of priority and posteriority, is intimately connected in the creation process. God brings a conceptual universe into being, and the implied past of that abstract universe does logically exist, at least in the mind of God. No detail of the universe is so unimportant to God that he does not directly will it. God numbers the hairs on our heads. All parts of creation are functional. Not all parts of creation are functional in the same way. A flying bird is fulfilling its telos. It is a well-functioning animal. A fossilized bird is not fulfilling its per se end, but it may be fulfilling its accidental end or its extrinsic end. That is, in shaping the universe towards God's glory. It also has a minor, albeit much present, causal contribution in shaping the Earth's layering or strata. As such, while a flying bird is fulfilling its telos of present function, a prochronically deceased bird is fulfilling its telos of causal coherence, but both are functioning very good. God could have willed all parts of the universe together at once. He could have willed the universe a relatively short period of time ago with some apparent cosmic history all in 1 second. Nonetheless, God chose to act as a cosmic workman, taking 6 natural days to bring creation into being. This provides the pattern and the foundation for our work week. God did this with foresight. He knew humans would fall and have a proclivity to worship the elements of the world. So, to make an important theological point, God spent days working on the different elements of creation. Humans are inclined to worship the sun, therefore, God gives them a day for creation. The same for animals, they get a day. As such, when God wills the light without a light bearer and wills the earth and its plant life without the secondary causes that sustain them, God is making 2 points. Firstly, God, not secondary causes, is our sustenance's true source. Secondly, God is patterning a cosmic temple out of the earth created first, and humans are at the center of it. That involves a certain logical ordering, and the creation days indicate that. He makes the created realms first 3 days before the creature kings of those realms, days 4 through 6. All the same, the creation is not complete until God fills in all the gaps. As such, God offers the causal contribution of the implied but not yet causally present element directly. God sustains the light as though the sun were doing it, moves the tides in such a way that the moon's presence is implied, and sustains gravitation as though the sun were in the picture. In my model, the presence of a fossil record is not problematic. It is no more disturbing than the existence of igneous rocks from volcanoes that never erupted in the diachronic time scheme. These animals have a conceptual life and death. While they do not have a real life and death, their abstract life and death have some impact on the earth as it is. I follow those fathers who felt animal death and predation are part and parcel of God's good creation, so fossils are not problematic. But I quite like William Dembski's theodicy for animal death, just as the imputation of Adam's sin has future tense implications, the imputation of Christ's righteousness and the imputation of Christ's righteousness past tense ones. Perhaps God willed the created order with the foresight of Adam's sin. That means creating a climate of corruption outside the garden with the foresight that Adam would fall. That does not involve setting him up for failure. None of the causes present in the garden necessitated his fall. A world of death and implied past history of death might impress upon Adam the threats of the law and the unfortunate bedfellow that is his eventual demise outside the garden. I will say, adding to these theses, Eric Phillips has this interesting idea that animal death as such isn't wrong, but animal death, when Adam enters the equation as the federal head of all creation, starts to become wrong because Adam has a certain prerogative over the animals. But since animal death before Adam wouldn't be evidence of Adam in the equation, this isn't theologically problematic. So the best objection to this view is this. If causal coherence is true, then would Adam have past memories? But I think this misunderstands the point of God's creative strategy. God may have made Adam at the point he would have created him if God chose to use diachronic history. I think the implied past teaches something like progressive creationism, but perhaps God wills Adam in the exact moment similar hominids would come about through evolution. I do not believe God gave these hominid souls, or even rational behaviors for that matter, so they have no bearing on the transfer of original sin, but they do provide the conceptual context for Adam's creation, and Adam's progeny may have interbred with him, just as they may have interbred with the angels in certain readings of Genesis 6. Moreover, God has another creative strategy in mind. He may have, at least. While there is no good argument for thinking an implied physical past is deceptive, there is a good argument for thinking an implied mental history is. It would undercut Adam's future memories. Thus, perhaps Adam is the exception here because Adam's mental life was essential to God willing Adam in media res, in the middle of things. God was introducing a new being into the equation, one whose mental life and creativity he valued much like his own. God's creative strategy wasn't complete causal coherence as such, but complete causal coherence for the recently created Adam to interact with. Adam himself is only as causally coherent as he needs to be to fulfill that task. That is, his body plan has the implied structure of a 30 or so year old man. Indeed, perhaps God gives Adam a 30-year-old's mental life, albeit without the memories of one. That is to say, God wills Adam as a causally coherent 30 or so year old without memories of an implied childhood. And that is the type of thing Adam and, in turn, Eve are. So I think this account has explanatory scope only for non-human appearance of age. Adam is fit to be our federal head precisely because he is the first human, and conceptual humans prior to Adam are theologically problematic. As such, I argue the earth is older than a straightforward reading of the Genesis genealogies would suggest. In doing so, I follow Byron C. Nelson and other Lutherans who accept gaps in the Genesis genealogies. Concordia Chicago's Andrew Steinman has recently defended this position. Steinman himself posits these gaps after doing a genre analysis of the genealogies in the scriptures, as well as a grammatical analysis of the verbs in the Genesis account. He is motivated not so much by a harmonization of the Genesis genealogies with modern science, but rather a harmonization of the chronology with the Egyptian one, which is much older than the 6 to 10,000 range that we typically see posited. So I will argue the term beget in the Genesis genealogies only means to establish a lineage or cause to bear. The account does not say the age of the progenitors at the birth of their progeny. Conceivably, the progenitor could be long dead at the birth of his progeny, but the account says, at the minimum, that this is when the progenitor caused the lineage or the line of descent that led to the birth of the progeny. The account connects Adam to Noah and Noah to Abraham. Genesis also describes the theologically significant persons in between. The ages are listed, not to say the age of the patriarchs at the birth of their progeny, but to describe when they appropriated the promise of the coming Messiah, the promised seed of Genesis 3. The ages decline as the earth falls into greater and greater sin, but God's providence in bringing the Messiah forth is greater than their sin. So yeah, with that said, this is my account. I don't think this represents the viewpoint of scholastic Lutherans, but it is personally the view that I take to the evidence. I see nothing theologically objectionable here. I think that it provides a lot of openness to the scientific evidence, and I think that the Christian can be comfortable with even entertaining notions like evolution in the midst of it. And I don't think that it's epistemically dangerous either. I think that provided that God doesn't create us with any past memories, there is nothing theologically problematic with God requiring us to think things about a past that is only conceptual and not actual, because God has done that before. He did it when he created Adam. He did it when he created these trees within one day. And he also did it in several of the miracles that exist in the scriptures. And as such, if God is capable of willing us to believe certain things in those situations, I see nothing logically incoherent with saying that God needs to or has reason for requiring us to believe things in other times. I think that you would have to posit some reason for thinking it's incoherent. God isn't willing Adam with past memories that would undercut his future ones. He is willing him with original righteousness, and that might imply some sort of maturity of thought, but I don't think it implies having knowledge of a child birth that never occurred. Yeah. So with that said, that is my account, and I look forward to uploading this. So yeah.